Good evening, everyone. It's not quite 8 o'clock and we've got a good number signed up. So if you'll bear with us, we'll just hold on to ensure everybody's safely in the virtual room. Okay, I think we'll make a start. Very good. Well, as the founding director of the Insiders Outsiders project, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. As many of you will know, the primary and original remit of Insiders Outsiders was to pay tribute to the hugely rich and indeed diverse contribution made by refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to this country's culture. But as again, many of you
have this before, and we don't know what to do about it.
Sorry, somebody is not muted.
I'm going to have to reboot. I've got a copy of what it is now, Vern.
Somebody
we have no idea why this.
Hold on. Let's. I'm going to just make sure everybody there. A few people, I thought I'd automatically muted everybody, but it clearly doesn't always work. Could everybody please ensure that they remain muted throughout? It's we don't need any background sound effects. Thank you. Okay, that seems to sort it out. Where was I? Yes, no, that actually one of the kind of natural sort of aspects of the afterlife, particularly the online afterlife of the Insiders Outsiders Festival, as it was, is to be able to explore in greater depth the creative responses of the so-called second generation. That's to say the children, actually the third generation in some cases too, the grandchildren of those who found sanctuary in this country. And that's where, of course, this evening's event fits in very well. David Jones, as we will hear, has come to see himself very much as an artist with a strong awareness of being second generation. So let me just start by saying, well, first of all, that it's being recorded, so do please stay muted, but equally it will give you a chance to either revisit or tell your friends about the event afterwards. The recording will be uploaded onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, which you can find easily courtesy of Google. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions as usual. I'm sure you all know the ropes by now via the chat function, and if you wouldn't mind addressing them to me, Monica Bohm-Duchin, rather than to everyone, that's I think generally a less distracting way to communicate. But let me start then properly by introducing Julia Weiner, who's going to be in conversation, as it were, with David Jones tonight. Julia, who I've known for many years and much admired what she does, is Associate Professor of Art History and Director of Liberal Arts at Regent's University in Regent's Park in London. Most relevantly for us today, she co-curated, well, 2 exhibitions. One was called Designs on Britain, which was looking, and it actually preceded the Insiders Outsiders Festival, but was very much part of the same sort of general terrain, which looked at the contribution made by Jewish refugees from Nazism to design in this country. But most relevantly for today, she co-curated a wonderful exhibition called, which some of you may have seen, called Shaping Ceramics, also held at the Jewish Museum just a few years ago. So I think, Julia, time to hand over to you, and I believe you'll in turn introduce our main attraction, as it were. Thank you very much.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Monica, for your kind words. Well, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. David Jones, a ceramicist, and we agreed that the first way that I should describe how we met, because I worked, and I want to mention my co-curator, my late friend, Aggie Katz, and Aggie and I basically traveled the country going to museums and looking at collections, and we knew some of our ceramicists we wanted to include. Of course, it was going to have Lucy Ree, Hans Koper, Ruth Duckworth, Margaret Marks, all refugees from Nazism who came to this country and made their name. But as research proceeded, and with the help of my friend Ruth Corman, who I can see here, we found others like Ray Silverman. We already knew Janet Haig. I remember the excitement when we realized that Antonia Salmon, whose work we had looked at, was her mother also was a refugee from Nazism. But there was one we didn't note, who was David Jones. And in an act of what he calls reverse nepotism, his daughter, Rhiannon, wonderful Rhiannon, was working at the Jewish Museum. And it was her who brought his work to our attention. And it was absolutely perfect. The exhibition went from refugees from Nazism, who basically shaped ceramics in this country, like Lucy Ree and Hans Koper, through to more modern workers. And then we had a section on ceramicists whose work actually reflected the Jewish experience, and that was David, absolutely perfectly, in fact possibly best fitted into that section. So we're going to start our conversation tonight talking about Englishness first, and the fact that I missed him because of the name, but it gives us a clue in both sides, and how you went from Englishness in your ceramics to exploring your Jewish identity, and particularly your family's traumatic history.
Thank you very much. So I've called this talk, Making Tracing, a Journey Back from England to the Polish Stetl. And I'm trying to make sense of who I am, where I come from, in terms of the work that I've done over 40 years. And to me, that seems, it's a reverse, almost a piece of reverse engineering. It's trying to understand what it is that I am and what I have become. And of course, one of the things that we're terribly aware of at the moment is the situation in Ukraine. It turned, when I looked at where my grandparents had come from, Galicia, in the bottom right-hand corner of Poland, it's right up against the Ukrainian border. And this image of blue skies and sunflowers, it reminded me of the Jonathan Safran Foer, everything is illuminated. And that sense of that, the way that history rolls on and people are subjected to the same sorts of persecution time and time again. So 100 years ago, our grandparents escaped from Poland and went to Leipzig in Germany to escape the oppression of...
Okay, I'm going to talk to Christine and see if we can do the...
Excuse me, everyone. There's, again, I'm afraid, at least one person who's not muted. Please. Hold on. I'm going to have to take action myself here.
Those who want will be able to. But I have to let you know. Okay.
David, I'm going to mute everyone because I'm not sure who it is who's unmuted, and then you can unmute yourself. Is that okay?
Yes.
David? Yes,
Yeah, yes, I understand. Yes.
we need to take action here, clearly. All right, so if you now just unmute yourself, that should do the trick.
Brilliant, thank you.
And Julia, you'll do the same, yeah? There we are, that's fine.
So,
Very much. I'm so delighted you all came, and I hope to be well, and we'll see you all next month.
What's going on? I've muted everyone. Why is it not working?
I think it's all right now, Monica.
Yeah, all right. Okay.
You want to give me sharing rights, I can do muting as well.
That's a good idea. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, sorry, David, about that.
so it's that idea that we're in this bottom southeast corner of Poland, and people just having to leave because of an oppressive situation. This is before Nazism. This is in the 1920s. So just about a century ago.
And can we talk about, yes, this is what I wanted.
So I looked forwards and backwards through my practice. And this is the area in which I live. This is Stratford-on-Avon. It's just 10 miles down the road. It's where Shakespeare was born. And it seems to me the absolute acme of what it is to be English. And I addressed this idea of Englishness because my practice was very much to do with raku. And raku derives out of an idea of a reaction to this incredible opulence. This is a tea room from the, which is a very Chinese influenced tea room. So it's incredibly rich, it's lavish, it's kitsch, it's blingy. And people moved to doing something very, very much more different from that. So raku is influenced by and informed by an idea of Zen Buddhism, of the Zen temples, of the raked gardens that we see. And on the left, we have this idea of what it is to take a pot out of a kiln, which is the structure you see at the back, the cylinder you see at the back, and plunge it into the sawdust in the bin at the front. And I was making these beautifully articulated objects using lusters, using this idea of very, very heavy reduction. So you've got pure metal of gold, silver, and copper left deposited on the surface and influenced by these patterns of lines that we saw earlier. And somebody said, why, this is a Japanese technique. Why are you doing this work to do with Japan? And my daughter, my eldest daughter, gave me the flattened can on the right-hand side. She found it on a street in Greece when we were on holiday there. And I based a body of work around that. This idea of tea set, of an English tea set, but interpreted and reinterpreted through the medium of ceramics and raku. So this is not functional, these are toxic glazes. And what you've got are some pieces that reference English tea ceremony. And so we've got this idea of the Englishness of afternoon tea, but also a reference to the Japanese tea bowl, a thick, heavy, restrained object that we will come to soon. Mark Rothko, who was born in Daugavpils, and I'm moving on my journeys backwards and forwards as I go through this talk. He was born in Daugavpils in the east of Latvia. And I did a residency there in 2018. There is no such thing as good painting about nothing. And it's something I've always considered. What is the work about? If you're hoping to make good work, it's got to be referential. And one of the things that happens through time is that the work is reinterpreted, it's revisited, and we make different sense of its content and its connotations. So this is a Rothko painting, blue and yellow. We reread it in terms of that image of the sunflowers, of the image of the Ukrainian flag that I am wanting to talk about today as well. That we need this idea of togetherness, of supportiveness against autocracy, against fascism. And we now can read the Rothko painting, this color field painting. These were famously paintings about paintings. They didn't have a reference. And yet now we can reappropriate that work and we can give it a new meaning. This is a picture. So how do I know I'm Jewish? What does that mean? I, of course, knew my mother, who's there in the front row, the tall one, in this picture, a school picture, had told us the story that she told us a narrative of our of her life. We'd asked, she had a very strong German accent, and an East German accent, so it was all ish and not ich. So it was not Hochdeutsch, it was a Plattdeutsch. And I arrived, and Ruth Corman, who I see in the audience, had invited me to give a series of talks and lectures in 1997 in Israel. And I taught in Tel Hai in the north, near Rosh Pinah, where my cousin Mike lives. And I was taken back to Tzfat by Daniel Flatow, and his late wife, Helen, asked about this question, what are you doing in Israel? And I said, somebody gave me a ticket, I came, that's what I do. And then she said, is that the only reason? I said, well, you know, my mother was born in Germany of Jewish parents, you know. And Daniel kind of looks at me and he says, you know what, this is where you have to start your learning. You're in Tzfat. And she says, but this is, you know, in 1923, your mother was born, so was mine. She was born in Leipzig, so was mine. And she went home and spoke to her mother, who brought that photograph we've just seen and this one, which shows my auntie Gitta somewhere in here. Hope my cousin Daniel and Jonathan are there to recognize her. There in the middle behind the tall girl. And the arrow shows Helen's mother, Leni, in that corner. And suddenly I've got this connectedness, not merely to where my mother came from, but also this history that is embodied in Israel. And it's a history, of course, that is contextualized by the fires of the Holocaust. And this is a picture of a Raku firing that I made, that I worked with on a collaborative exhibition and a book with my friend Rod Dorling. And these images had a meaning for me at one point about telling people how work was made, of how the fire was an integral part of the Raku process. And then I later reappropriated my own images to make sense of what it is to have grandparents who are murdered and are burned. And this seems to me to be an incredibly important aspect of where my work has gone to. The Raku asks about a much more restrained palette than I showed you at the beginning. And it also has a very strong relationship to the idea of the tea room, of the place where tea is drunk in a very, very ceremonial fashion. And the way that we can use, and this is a footpath to a tea house. And in the exhibition that I made in 2001, Fixing Light, Fixing Fire, which was a collaborative venture between Rod Dorling, the photographer, and John Bell, exhibition designer, and had a catalogue essay by Catherine Bates, who I see in the audience as well. We worked together to try and understand what it was that we could do to talk about Raku. And it's very much a focus on Raku, and yet other things kept coming through it. These images of fire, these images of incineration, the blackness of the surface, the path has become the series of tiles underneath, which are fired kiln slabs and we took from a factory in the Midlands. But it's this idea that you're making a journey through an exhibition, and it's about pots, it's about vessels, it's about contained space, about pots that hold something. Maybe they hold meaning. And on the wall, you can see a series of images that were taken from the inside of the China clay pit in St. Austell. And it's a 360-degree panorama that surrounds the exhibition. So it's an image of a bowl made of clay, made in clay, that is about half a mile across. It's this enormous hole. So it's pots within pots within pots, this piece. This was a photograph that Rod made for me of pieces that we pulled out from the exhibition. And it just struck me at some point that they were like chimneys. And I had 2001, I had this memory of chimneys, of the gas ovens in Buchenwald, in Auschwitz, and thinking, okay, there's something happening there. And at the same time, I'm wanting to start to move towards a more restrained palette. This is a Japanese tea water container, and it's a broken, it's a cast-off pot. It's just been found by the tea master Senno Rikyu, and it's been incorporated into the tea ceremony as something that's been given a new meaning. And it's that idea of the new meaning that I keep wanting to come back to. This is another photograph. It's a photograph of a group of pots that was made in 2001. And yet, when I went to Buchenwald in 2011, there is another sort of installation. It's actually the group, these are metal urns sold by the company Topfzone, which translates as Pot and Sons, who were the manufacturers of the gas ovens that were used and built in Buchenwald and also Auschwitz, and I think another 20 concentration camps. And they are very pots-like. They are metal containers. They were found in the attic of one of the huts in Buchenwald. And it's this idea that you can look at something like that and you can say, this is really rather a beautiful object. It reminds me of a Giorgio Morandi still life. It's an installation type of piece, and yet it's got this much more sinister aspect. I was then invited by Monika Gass of Krank Museum Westerwald to make a piece of work for the museum then. Durch das Feuer gehen means tested by fire, going through. And we worked to install that in the museum as a collaborative venture. And it's a group of similar sorts of pieces, but the way of displaying them is now changed. And the pieces themselves are looking as if they've been disturbed. I wanted to give an impression, the metal grids are the metal grid of the size that is used in an archaeological investigation. They're meter square grids, and you would just square up the ground in order to dig test holes. And the pieces that I've made are lying on their sides, they're disturbed. So the experience is not of an easy association with the work. And the shadows start to play an important part. It's this idea that maybe something is missing. And in the top right corner, I hope it's the same way around on your screens, there is a projection that we made of clouds. I suddenly thought, perhaps this looks like smoke coming from chimneys. I'm in Germany. This is my first museum show in Germany. Am I going to start to address those issues? And I was starting to affect the work on the surface of the pieces. Like Skin was a group of pieces that reflected that referenced to some extent the work of Lucio Fontana, who slashed the canvases. It's this idea of going beyond the pictorial space of the canvas, of treating the canvas as a real thing. As a potter, we're able to deal with the surface of the clay and to use it as the surface, perhaps like human skin. And the skin of the pot sits on something that's made of clay. And the word we use for clay is clay body. We also use the word body politic. We have this idea of the way that human bodies, clay bodies, social bodies have some sort of analogy. And those are the things that I'm trying to work on. I've missed out 2007 when I suddenly had to go to hospital for quadruple heart bypass operation. Therefore, this was something that saved me from dying. And I emerged with a very nice cut down the center of my chest, and I arrived in China. And I'd curated the group of clay artists to go to China. And two of them were two very close female friends of mine, my colleague Gwen Heaney, who has sadly since died, and Sandy Brown. And they said, so David, what is the work you're going to do? I had not actually been in the studio for 8 months. And I arrived in China, and it was probably very foolish to go there because I did become ill. But I made a body of work about this idea of what had happened to my own physical body. So my physical body starts to become part of this. These were extrude tubes, extruded by the factory, and I affected them. I slashed them and stretched them and marked them. So they reflected the marks that were still very, very raw on my body. And I arranged them, disposed them in the way of the terracotta warriors. The Qin emperor's tomb in which these were discovered is in Xi'an, which was about an hour away from where we were based in Fuping. So this was absolutely on the doorstep of what was going on. And so, after I visited there, it gave me the absolute sense of how I might show the work. It's also the way that the roll call was memorialized in this photograph at the concentration camps. People having to stand outside in the freezing cold for hour upon hour every day. And I realized that I could start to use this language of ceramics that I had developed over this time to start to talk about my immediate family. My grandmother, whom none of us ever met, and this is my mother on the right, her sister Gitta next to her, Leia, and then Leo, the youngest, and then our grandmother. The two eldest children had possibly already left Leipzig, or they certainly weren't in this photograph. And I made a body of work about the idea of this grandmother and her 6 children having got to England. And it's an installation I made in Estonia. I was invited to a wood fire conference, and wood firing is a process by which the pieces are burnt very, very savagely in a very, very hot fire. So here are, my Auntie Anne is included in this picture, as is my grandfather. My mother is on the far left. And trying to make sense of different ways of expressing this idea of 6 children who somehow escape, of using the narrative of firing pots, of putting them in really dangerous parts of the kiln. They're burnt, the pieces themselves are squeezed and broken, and there is damage to them. And it's something that all of us of my generation are slowly or quickly coming to terms with, that there has been a whole, that dislocation of our parents, of our grandparents to Germany, of our parents to England, has absolutely and profoundly affected us in ways that I certainly did not understand, and that I'm still coming to terms with, even as I approach my 7th decade. So this is an idea of the way that when you put a pot, when you put clay into the bottom of the fire pit in a wood-fired kiln, that it is absolutely, the body of the clay itself is burnt, the carbonization impregnates the porous clay. And I continued this idea when I was invited to a symposium in Römhild. Römhild is in Thuringia, in the former east of Germany, and just 8 kilometers over the border, in the old dividing line between West and East Germany. So I wanted to do a piece that not merely spoke about my separation, my dislocation from Germany, where my mother had been born, but also that separation that had happened to those German people. So the people in East Germany had been separated for 30 years from their friends, family, colleagues in West Germany. Only 8 kilometers away, 5 miles away, was West Germany. And this piece used ceramics as a metaphor, and also the idea of the old shelving system that I found in the factory where we were very kindly hosted. And there's at the front here on the left-hand side, there is another piece of rubbish that I'd appropriated from the factory site. It's an old container, but it reminded me so strongly of the trucks that had been used in Buchenwald to transport bodies to the crematoria. And at the beginning, right at the far end, there was a tray that they'd made especially for me that had that idea of clinical purity, that had an idea of trying to refine something. It also references a very important piece of work by Joseph Beuys called Wirtschaftswerte, meaning economic values. Inside this, you can see that it is also made of shelving. This piece by Beuys used his own iconography of fat and felt, as well as stuff that he just picked up off a shelf in Germany. So it just had a resonance for me in the way that I was able to make a piece of work that toured and then I could reconstruct it in a variety of different ways in different venues. It also is strongly resonant of the bunks in the huts in the concentration camps. And this is a hut in Buchenwald, and it's very like the hut I visited in Sachsenhausen, where my grandfather Aaron was incarcerated, and from where he was shot. And it's this idea that you can actually use the referencing of art in order to speak about these other experiences, and maybe people will pick up that idea, maybe they will not. And some of the individual shelves had different sorts of items on them. And so these were hearts made in the hand, made by somebody but it's made by just squeezing clay in my hands. Made of porcelain, and then surrounded by this piece of saw blade to reference the concentration camp surrounds of barbed wire. The rings were very important. If one Googles Buchenwald, which was literally just up the road from Römhild, and from which I was taken very kindly by the organizers of the symposium. If you Google Buchenwald, one of the things that comes up is an image of rings. And the rings are stolen from the people who are murdered. By and large, they're the Jews, communists. As we know, the homosexuals were also targeted, and people, the Roma and the Gypsies, were also victimized. But the ring had only economic value, Wirtschaftswerte. It did not have the value that we place on a ring that has got the emotional value of connectedness to another person. So the wedding ring, the Eheringe, had no value anymore. And so I made these rings, and I worked with, we had a lot of visiting groups, and I worked with the visiting groups making these rings, and we assembled piles and piles of them. The clay ring, when it's fired, has got absolutely no value. It's a piece of clay that we can't reuse, and they're just little sausages that are made into a ring shape. Incredibly fast, they've got no value. So they're set against this idea of the object with great value. And I can see in the work now that there's this development from these very beautiful, highly decorated, very sensuous surfaces to this very distressed, broken, a completely different vocabulary, and a vocabulary that references really the wabi-sabi of Zen Buddhism and of early Raku, rather than the Western Raku that I'd started in. I also used to try and make sense of the work. I also appropriated the poetry of Paul Celan, who has the very fortunate name that sounds like porcelain. And Paul Celan's poem Totentanz deals with this idea of what it is to have people exterminated and to just appear as smoke. And I used the imagery of the poem and juxtaposed it with materials that I found from the factory site. So this is just swarf from metal turnings that had been machined off on a lathe. Dein ashenes Haar Schulemit, dein goldenes Haar by contrast. And you just see that this is this idea that we've got something that is now rubbish, It's deemed worthless. And this was the life and the value of the Jews who were murdered and burned. And then the next day, some more school parties came round, happy, jolly kids wanting to do something with clay. And I started to work with an idea that we could do together, something together, Zusammenstücke, I called them, together pieces. That you literally put a sausage of clay in your hand and you clasp somebody else's hand and you get an object out. And this object, if it's left, if it's unfired, if we leave it out in the rain, it returns to mud. It's evanescent, it's ephemeral. But these pieces, which have been fired in a porcelain kiln, will last longer than the history of civilization. It'll easily last 8,000 years. And so it's a record that can, and that it will last long after I've died, after the people I've made these with have died. So it's this idea that I'm making something that is a positive, a coming togetherness. And it seemed to me that the journey has to encompass an understanding that people can change, that peoples can change, that we cannot hold a nation responsible. And indeed, I would like to emphasize the fact that the Germans have done an incredible job of education, on working with Jewish returners, particularly to Leipzig. I've been back and I find it a very, very positive experience. And that they've addressed this idea of endlessly questioning what it is that we're being told. Is it true or not? And so the together pieces, the Zusammenstücke, are a record of that and a record of that experience. This is where, and in 2016, my cousin Sylvie said, you know what, cousins, she said, we really should do something to celebrate the deaths of our grandparents. Nobody has ever marked it in any way whatsoever. And my cousin Daniel composed a book, and one of the images he found was this image, which is the Kolbashova coat of arms. Our grandparents came from Tarnów and Kolbashova, and this is the coat of arms. It's a together piece. We can put a piece of clay between those hands and we have some of my work. And it's that idea of the Christian and the Jew coming together. This is the journey that anybody going from Kiev to the border will have to be making. It's a 9-hour car journey. And if they go on to Kolbashova in Poland, which is just across the border, as you can see, it's that's so the journey that our grandparents made is this journey for going west. Everybody has been traveling west, and so the journey my parents, our parents made, the grandparents made the journey to Leipzig, and our parents made the journey from Leipzig to England. So these are journeys which need to be, in some sense, memorialized. This is the only picture that we have of our grandmother in Kolbashova. It's a peasant Stetl. And it's this idea that we are now in this very sophisticated century that is trying, where a mad situation of war is developing. And this is my grandfather, the Aaron Stimler. He is the son of a rabbi. He loses his faith. He shaves off his beard. He cuts his locks. And he becomes an atheist communist, yet still Jew. And he is a #1 problem for the Nazis when they come to power. This is where they end up in Leipzig. This is Goldharn Gessien. And the girls in the doorway indicate that this is a prostitute's row. This is the poorest of the poor people. And it's an image that I was given by the welcoming committee in Leipzig. It just gives a sense of how Leipzig was. It's totally destroyed in the war by the bombing. It's very near the railway, which was obviously subject to extreme bombing. And they also gave me the book Menschen ohne Grabstein, People Without Gravestones. And it's where you see the names of our grandparents absolutely clearly written and where they died. It was a very brutal introduction to that death, and it forced me to think about how it was when I was a baby. My mother was 30. 15 years earlier, she just got to England on the Kindertransport. And the trauma of that had not, in my upbringing, in our upbringing, by and large, our parents tried not to influence their children, tried not to make them feel terrified. But some of that fear is obviously there. And I understand now the fear and the terror much more strongly, particularly because we're following the news all the time about what's happening in the Ukraine. What is it that we can contain? What is it that we can show through damage? We can show something that is through a pot. We can reference a font, a Christian icon. It can be a container of memories, and yet it can also contain damage. And when I was in Daugavpils, I made this body of work that referenced the murders in the Rombala forest and Daugavpils, when the Nazis emptied the ghettos, and these were the two largest murders of Jews before Babi Yar, and therefore before the final solution was decided at Wannsee, because nobody could take standing there shooting people and tipping them into a trench. And so I've used this idea of the burnt vessel, the burnt pot, and the broken surface in order to try to convey a sense of what it is in this journey. And Daugavpils, as I said, was the place where Mark Rothko was born. And this is it's being shown here on a burnt piece of metal, and trying to make assemblages that talk about the murder of 20,000 people in 2 days by firing squad. And just about then, the more recent work, which is about coming together again, trying to show how you can use ceramics in order to make connections, that you can actually use it in order to bring people together. And I just mentioned this one very briefly now. My Name is Nobody, Clay Odyssey. It was a piece of I was invited by Leipzig City Council to make collaborative work with the Syrian asylum seekers in 2017. And I recapitulated this idea, amongst others, of the squeeze of the hand, we made great piles of these, of soft clay marks that just show two people have met, that we show our common humanity. And the way, and I've used that more recently in a residency I had in Holland, in the European Ceramic Work Center, of pieces which are handprints, but then the handprint pushed into something else. And they are much greater than life size, so they've been exported through a computer and digitally printed. So the hand is removed from its handedness. And that seems to me really very important. And this gives an idea of the way that you can use the computer and using digital programs to output. This is the together piece again, but made in a whole variety of different sizes of mold and then press molded. And some of these are ceramic printed. So we've got a whole variety of ways of dealing with this idea of how you come together and how you look at the other. And if I just sort of mention at the end, one of the philosophers, you saw, I was introduced as Dr. David Jones. I did a PhD that absolutely addressed my identity as a second generation Holocaust survivor. And that is available on my website, which is just coming up in a second. And in it, I use the ideas of Emanuel Levinas, the Lithuanian Jewish philosopher, who talked about the face of the other. This idea that once you are looking at the other, then you will start to respond to them and you can develop a proper ethical code. And before we go, we must again think about what's happening in Ukraine. There's nothing so difficult to go back to sanity, said Bertolt Brecht. Who knows where we're going to end up, but thank you very, very much for your attention, and thank you, Julia and Monica, for the invitation.
So I've got a couple of questions that we had discussed a little bit, David, and then we'll see if we've got anybody else. Monica's got the rest of the questions. So the first thing when we first talked about it was your first body of work. Obviously you've shown how you've been working towards that, but your first body of work that referenced this came after the heart bypass surgery. That's where you first sort of started doing the scarred work. But these scars must have been there before, because you talked about how your mother didn't mention very much about her upbringing when you were a child. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that's something that's very important and interesting, and something that comes out a lot in our insiders outsiders meetings.
It was obvious that our mother had a very unusual accent. The children in school noticed it. Of course, my brothers and sister did not, I assume. We couldn't hear it. My father had a very strong Welsh accent. And so I was able to just pass as David Jones. As somebody English, maybe I had a Welsh father, but it was not necessary to make it extant that I was Jewish. And we obviously asked our mother about, at some point you ask your parents about their upbringing. And my father had lots of funny stories, and my mother had this terrible, terrible story that was incredibly exciting. It's the story that the Ukrainians will have about their experience. And at the same time, I knew that it was not a question I could ask anything about. My sister, Susan, managed in some way to get through that. And I know that when a couple of my brothers have had more information, but I really couldn't ask anymore. I remembered what I could try to remember, but the rest of it I blanked in the way that second generation Holocaust survivors do. It's absolutely repressed. And it's I feel I'm very lucky to be able to manifest it through this ceramic work. But my sister enabled my mother, she helped her write a book that my mother called Sunday's Child. And together they produced a book that told this story. And with the book that we worked on with my cousin Daniel, and the celebration that Sylvie organized for all of us cousins, we were able to start to put some of the mosaic back together, that we were able to make sense of what it was. And yes, I've forgotten that, you know, we need to dedicate a talk like this to our grandparents, Talbot and Aaron, and all the others who were murdered, and indeed the people who are now being murdered in the Ukraine. It doesn't seem to stop.
I've got one more question and then we'll open it up. But the first time that you made this work was, of course, when you went to Germany, and we've had other works, other exhibitions on similar themes in other places in Germany, several places in Germany and in Latvia. You talked about, obviously, German education, and I've heard this too from Holocaust survivors who've worked both in English schools and German schools, that in the German schools they feel much more, they felt much more welcomed. But what was the reaction, first of all, when you proposed these sort of themes, and secondly, from visitors?
As I say, as I say to you, the experience in Germany was very, very open. And as an artist, we generally are able to express ourselves in the West in an incredibly free way. And they were incredibly embracing of that desire to try to not merely understand the past, but to make a bridge to the future. So that sense of how you move backwards and forwards is very, very difficult, is very, very important. And the Germans seem to be addressing that in a much more significant way than we are in England. One of the, we hear, on a weekly basis, the way that the story of empire has not been fully expressed in our country. And we had Troy, something, the captain of the Birmingham football team, saying, he didn't learn anything about this history of what happened to his people in that situation in empire. And the great thing about what's happening in Germany is that although it was an awful, awful desecration of a people's, they are trying to redress that. It will never be redressed, they know it. There's nothing that can ever happen that can make that good, but they can do their very best to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And I think in that way, the German education system is doing better than our education system in terms of properly comprehending our shared pasts.
Thank you. I just wondered, actually, as a final thing, we obviously showed your work in a very Jewish setting, in a Jewish themed show. Has it been seen in other places in this country? And, have there been reactions? Because you do make a good point there that it's been shown widely in Germany, but has it been shown here as well?
I haven't, not in an extant fashion. It's actually the proposal I made, obviously, to Monica about participating in Inside or Outside. That I would do a physical show that would build on that would build on that exhibition. But we've had a situation where we've not really had exhibitions that can work in that way at the moment. I was invited to do a big show in Leipzig that was going to address all of this, but of course it was that's why I did the residency in Holland, but that was at the start of COVID. And so I've lost that opportunity at the moment. And I will try and regain it, but there's much more openness and an interest in these areas in Germany than there is here.
Thank you. And we've got Stephen Bramfman who'd like to unmute and ask a question. So Stephen, would you like to do that?
Sure. David, great to see you again. Your talk is fascinating and remarkable in scope and emotion. And my question is, and I hope I'm not reading anything into this that is not there, but it seems to me that a long period of time went by when you were slowly beginning to recognize inadvertent connections between your work and the Holocaust before you overtly began to connect your work with inspiration from the Holocaust and your experience and your family's experience. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yes, certainly. Yes, thank you. If I just say that Steve is a very well-known raku potter in America, who's also made a very remarkable body of work about the death of his son, which is also this idea of using ceramic in order to speak a Kaddish for.
Thank you, David.
But it's this idea that you can use ceramic in order to talk about those experiences. And you're absolutely deceptive. I was just making, I fell into using a process that dealt with a burnt surface, and I was doing things to the clay pot that I didn't quite understand. And I always recall my mother saying, David, you're making such beautiful work, but you always do something to damage it. You cut something out of the top. You're hitting it, you're breaking it, you're making these cracks. And I said, well, it's expressive, Mum, it's expressive. And I really, it's interesting that she noticed this. She's the person who drew my attention to it. And I had a rationale. And it's a problem. I mean, I've got a philosophy degree. There's always, I was taught a lot of clever ways to think out of difficult situations and to try to avoid answering this deep Zen question. What is the work about? Just keep asking yourself. And it slowly materialized that I could do this. And in fact, I didn't do one PhD, I did two. And the second one, I had the good fortune to have a supervisor who said, let's see whether we can turn this round, Jim Orlick, and turn this around and focus on this aspect of the Jewishness. So it came very much from that theoretical perspective as well, of trying to understand what it is to have a tactile, a haptic response to clay, of making sense of connectedness to the clay body, and then of what it is to burn ceramics. I mean, the Germans used the same word, brennen, for firing as well as for burning something, as well as for ceramic firing. And it's much easier to make some of these points in that language. But absolutely, it was very slow growth in my own sensibility that that's what I was doing. And it was really interesting in the Jewish ceramic exhibition that Julia curated, that I clearly was one of the few artists who was wanting to directly reference and talk about Jewish experience through the ceramics.
I wonder, Julia, if I might come in there, and you mentioned earlier on Janet Haig as being part of the exhibition at the Jewish Museum, and I think she is perhaps, somebody who might also sort of buck the trend there, but also that there is in fact a short film, a rather beautiful interview with Janet on the Insiders Outsiders website. If you simply Google www.insidersoutsidersfestival.org or simply Insiders Outsiders Festival, and then on the homepage there's a section called Fractured World. Oh, is that the right? Yes, which actually is well worth looking at for the other interviews, but Janet is well represented there. I also wanted to mention, I just can't resist doing so, and a long time ago now, in the mid or early 1990s, I had the challenge and indeed the privilege of curating an exhibition looking at contemporary artists' responses to the Holocaust across a whole range of different media across the world. And one of the things I will always remember is my encounter and indeed my inclusion of an artist called Daisy Brandt. And I don't know, David, whether you ever have come across her. She survived 7 different camps, I think, at the age of 14. And she survived and she became a ceramicist. She made beautiful pots, but with no evident connection to her experience until the 1990s. Like many other survivors, a necessary time lag had to pass before she was able to sort of start engaging with her experience. And then she used the medium of ceramics or porcelain to create these kind of wall plaques that did allude allusively, but quite explicitly, to her experience in the most poetic and beautiful ways. And I wonderful work, and I don't think she's sufficiently well known, and I must see, perhaps I can provide a link if I can find further information about her, but I did include her in an exhibition called After Auschwitz: Responses to the Holocaust in Contemporary Art, and I think the catalogue is probably still available on Amazon and in libraries.
Well, Monica, I just want to step in. Daisy and I had been friends for
how wonderful.
8 years.
Is that Stephen again?
Yes, and we both lived in Newton, Massachusetts, and we had exhibited together more than a few times over the years. Yes.
Oh, I'm so touched to hear that. Is she still alive?
We haven't been in touch in a long time. And I suspect that she is, because I think I would have heard otherwise, but I'm not sure.
If you do, could I urge you? I don't have any contact details for her. If you do get in touch with her, please give her
I will.
my very, very, very warmest best wishes. If you do a Google Images search for Daisy Brandt, Brand, you'll get some sense of her beautiful work. And that actually brings up another question, David, if I may. It's this sort of almost heartbreaking kind of bringing together of horror and beauty, in both in her work, but in your work also, that kind of completely impossible but fruitful relationship. And also a question, there are one or two, yes, there's some questions I mustn't omit to come to, but I'm just wondering in a sense practical, but also conceptual terms, when you exhibit your work wherever, to what extent do you provide explanatory or expository panels alongside the work itself, or do you in fact prefer the work to speak to whatever extent it can, depending on who's looking, without any verbal commentary?
I'm very keen to use both.
Mm-hmm.
I think the language, the problem with the language of ceramics is that it is universal. They're pots to some extent, or they're handprints. I think they're quite easy to identify what these things are, but I would like them to be handled in the way that we handle a cup of tea, or that we handle a cup and saucer. And if if these things are moved away from that handling activity, and you can't just do it intuitively, then it's really useful and really helpful to have the explanation. So I think with a lot of contemporary art manifestations, you need somebody to guide you gently through it. And I don't see that the work doesn't make sense without the explanation, but I do use explanatory panels if I possibly can, just to give people an introduction, and like a label attached to a painting. I'd probably like to distance it to some extent, but I do write a lot. And if you look at the website, you can see that I've tried to make sense of the work for myself using words and language. And I just happen to have a degree in philosophy and literature. So the work is something that I'm trying to comprehend in that way. But again, it's been incredibly helpful to have had other interlocutors like Catherine to write about my work, to try to make sense of what it is that they see in the work. And that's what Catalogue Essay does, is that it exists in order to help guide somebody through something that is perhaps less familiar. We're familiar with the pot as a utensil, as a functional item, but as a container of meaning, I think it's something much more unusual, and it just requires a certain sort of help, but in a gentle way.
I'm amused in a way, David, that you say I just happen to have a PhD in philosophy. Of course, it's not at all accidental, because it's precisely that more sort of intellectual and conceptual approach that actually enriches the different levels at which one can, engage with your work. There's a question, I think somebody called Michelle, is it, who's had her virtual hand raised. Would you like to unmute yourself, Michelle, and say whatever you wanted to say?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I arrived late. I think I have a couple of comments. Hold on, I'm in a noisy place. 1 second, please.
The bigger one?
The question I have is, and the comments are, first of all, I think it's a big difference between a person who has suffered through the Holocaust and then the G2 that you're talking about, David. It's a very subtle difference, but you use the term unspoken. And I just want to stress from my experience and from others, the lessons the G2, Generation 2 learns that are never outlined. Don't talk about this, don't talk about that. You're not really said to do that. You just absorb it, that are uncomfortable. So I think I just want to tell you how strong that impressed upon me, because I have spent a long time figuring out the influences, both beautiful and more negative, that my two parents have had, both with tremendous wartime experiences. Do you, the generation that suffered through this, I am always amazed at conferences how many psychotherapists and psychologists there are, incredible number. And do you think the art found you, or did you find the meaning through the art? Where was the...
Okay, thank you. So that's a really interesting sort of set of observations. So absolutely, it's a two-way, that's why I described it as a journey. And I started doing something. I did a degree and in philosophy and literature, and I ended up making some pots, because I started a medical degree, and it wasn't important in that time that we used the investment in the degree to get a job. It's not like my children or the grandchildren will be, that they have to monetize their degrees. I did something that was interesting. And I then became a potter. And I just made useful pots. And I made objects which I could sell. And I did something that I enjoyed doing. And at some point, the objects started to speak back to me. And you spend a lot of time as a maker, as a potter, as an artist, with whatever it is you have manufactured. And if you're lucky, you're invited to put them in exhibitions, and you start to make sense of them. So they start to talk back to you. So absolutely, once they start talking back, then you realize that you're then you realize that you're doing something that you can respond to. And it's one of the reasons I sent the invitation out to as many of my former students as possible, because I learned so much through teaching. I subjected these poor individuals to a series of questions that I didn't turn on myself. I asked them, what's your work about? What are you doing here? Why are you doing it? What's the meaning of this glaze? What is this form here for? And of course, the moment you're in the psychotherapeutic position, it protects you. It holds you in a safe place, in a way that being exposed through being a student again, through doing the PhD, left me open to having to answer those questions. And having asked the questions for 30 years, I was very able to ask the questions of myself and to carry on trying to answer them. But it's been an incredible, it seemed, you know, when I do the show, when I do the slide presentation, it seems very easy. It seems facile to me and a logical sort of continuum, but it's very, very hard one for me. I didn't find it at all easy. And absolutely, I then started to deliberately make art about that experience because something had been revealed to me previously. And it's the way, in a sense, that potters work, or painters work, or sculptors work. You make something, you live with it, and then you make the next one.
David, there's a question that relates to that. I think quite an astute observation. Well, it's a question, but in the sort of with an implied observation. Do you make individual pots with a view to their place in an installation? Can a piece be separated from its companions? Because much of your work is indeed about forms in relation to other forms. I wonder if you'd like to comment.
Sorry, who asked that?
It's somebody, I think it's Jacqueline Langer-Hobson.
Very, not one of those unfortunate students who thought they should put me on the spot. It's like a mirror question. And all of it. The answer is yes. I make individual pieces that can be used in an installation. I make pieces that are only have sense in the installation at that time. And then the installation is broken down and I might use those pieces in another way at another time. So they are not unique to that body of work, unless they're purchased by a museum.
I'm aware of time drawing on. There's a question, an obvious question. What are you working on at the moment? What is in the pipeline?
So I'm actually still very interested in the body. So the pieces that are to do with the hand, I'm working with a group, working collaboratively on a ceramic printing exhibition in Holland. And we're looking at the way that modern technologies of using digital processes can be used with ceramics. So ceramic printing means using a computer program to drive a printer. So it's like a writing printer, but it pumps out a tube of clay. And it makes, it'll build up a series of coils endlessly going up, and you can make them big coils, small coils, you can smooth them. And it makes for a body of work that can, I mean, I can make something, I can design something here, scan it, send it to Holland, it can be made there. So I'm interested in this idea of the way that, you know, the Levinas, the Emmanuel Levinas quote of the connectedness of people, of the face of the other, the hand of the other, the body of the other, the way that I can take something like that and take it, an analog process of hand making, and then put it through a digital process and then make a virtual work of art from that. So what I'm working on for that is another resonance of the body, something to do with the hand, but also to do with the bodies that were found in the bog. So if you've been to the British Museum and seen Peat Marsh, one of the bog bodies, I'm making work that references those crushed heads. So it's literally a piece of, it's an enclosed piece of clay that's squashed and burnt fire.
Going back to your comment about these new processes, somebody called Anne Kelsey, whom I suspect you know, but actually echoing something I was going to ask, for somebody, as she puts it, who is so hands-on with your clay, how does ceramic printing sit with you, David? Honestly, you know, there's surely it's a totally different approach, isn't it?
Yes, so I used it you'll be delighted to know that I spent a lot of time using scans of the physical space between two hands. They're scanned and then used to make molds. So I actually spent 3 months making molds, using molds, slip casting, and press molding, which of course is a hand process. But it's to do with an idea. The outcome is a very physical object, but they are very conceptual pieces. They are about hand making. They're about the nature of connectedness between human beings, and yet they are very much existing in a virtual world. So it's this idea of moving between closeness and distance, of proximity and a sense of being far away, that I'm wanting to try to access. And yes, I missed the hapticity in this, but I'm referencing the handmade. And it's just so, Michelle asked the question about, was I directing the journey or was it taking me on a journey? I'm being taken on the journey. I'm able to follow these really interesting directions where I don't know what the answer is. I do something and then I try to find out what it is I've done.
Well, that's a wonderfully eloquent answer, just like the rest of your presentation, David. Julia, I feel I've been slightly hogging the final part of the session. Is there anything else you wanted to comment on? Or
it's just one thing that when I was doing my research on David, it was so obvious. Well, I said to him, you're like prophetic, because the final body of work is about the hands clasping, and then we have COVID and we can't do that. And I'm just wondering if this is working in the virtual way was something that you came up with during the pandemic to get around the problems that you couldn't work closely with other people, which has obviously been so much a part of your practice.
Thank you for reminding me. Yes, so I'd actually done the body of work just before COVID, so that was I did it in 2017, and in 2018 I got COVID in very early on, and really quite badly. And luckily I've got a lot of cousins who are doctors who were there on our cousins' WhatsApp, were able to direct me to the right medicines and the right way to negotiate the health service. So I was very lucky to have that kind of support. And I had so through COVID, I realized that I had made a body of work that made sense of that experience. And so I've written about it, and it's on the top of the website, I think, that it talks about losing my sense of smell, my sense of taste through COVID, of not being able to touch people because I'm in isolation for 2 weeks. And it was an extraordinary moment in time where you're by yourself and a lot of your senses are going. Luckily, my hearing and my sight didn't go. But the idea that I made a body of work about this inability, this lack of opportunity to access and to touch people seemed to me absolutely prophetic. And so I've wanted to do something with this. I've shown it a tiny bit. I showed it in Taiwan in the IAC exhibition and more recently, but I haven't had that opportunity to do it. So I would, if somebody says, oh yes, I've got just the exhibition for you, I'd be absolutely delighted to collaborate on that.
I think it's probably time, isn't it, reluctantly to round things up. The fact that we've kept most of the people who were here from the start is obviously a great compliment to you, because it is becoming quite late in the evening. Perhaps I can just end up, David, by reading out, you may or may not already have noticed it, but somebody in the audience called Alison Wilson, who's I think made a lovely concluding comment. She said, this has been a fascinating, enlightening and topical indeed. You know, how sad, but yes, indeed, how topical this event's been. I love your work and the associations within your work, especially the grasped lumps of clay. And they make me think of the creation, Adam and Eve, hand in hand in Eden and on into the wilderness. Thank you very much for this inspiring session. I think that's rather wonderful. So thank you, Alison, for that input. So I think it just remains for me to thank David hugely for this really absorbing and profoundly moving and informative and provoking presentation.
And please, if you could put my email up again.
I will, you know what I'll do as a follow-up, I'll do it tonight or tomorrow first thing. I will send all the relevant, I'll put your website up, your email address, which is presumably on the website, also the Janet Haig recording that I mentioned and other things besides.
And this recording.
And this recording, of course, takes a few days for it to get to sort of be trimmed, but it will be on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. So yes, I'll make sure that everybody.
So some of you I see on a regular basis, and some I clearly haven't seen for years.
How nice! I can also say I can send you a transcript of the chat as well, David. So
thank you. I have. Thank you.
Lovely. No,
I just wanted to say hello to David, who I haven't seen for 14 years. But you used to have hair then, David. But this was fantastic. And you know, it relates very much to my own background, as you know, about my Hungarian Jewish background, its connection to raku and wood firing. So it was all very personal. And thank you so much for inviting me.
Lovely to see you all. Thank you. Thank you for
coming. You can stay on if you want, but I think I probably ought to end the proceedings here. Thank you very much, everyone, for being such a responsive audience, and I hope to see you at other. I should actually also mention, just I should have said it from the start, that there is now a sort of subsection, as it were, on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel called Second Generation Voices, and indeed includes some third generation as well. So we've had a number of events, not just in the visual arts, but also writers, and there will be some music events to come, you know, exploring this very rich cultural terrain of people like David, who so wonderfully engages with the difficult past that so many of us have to also grapple with. Thank you very much, everyone, and good night and keep safe. All the very best.